We've got a special guest today. Eddie Craig uh, does a podcast at taooflaw.com and has been a part of the Rule of Law Radio Network and Logos Radio Networks for a long time. Eddie, welcome to Joe Baker's Remedy Report.
Thank you for having me.
We've got a common friend, Roger, who kind of said, hey, we should maybe do a show together and talk about some of these things. We both, I think, we both see the need to grapple with tyranny in the law systems in the world. That's how I would summarize it. But tell us about yourself and what got you interested in law doing today, Eddie.
Well, I started off as a United States Air Force after I graduated high school. From there, I learned avionics and electronics and computer systems and programming and all that. And when I got out, I became a private computer consultant. I traveled all over. I was making decent money, and I was helping out my family with whatever money I could. And one year, my mom sent me an email saying that she had gotten a notice that they wanted to steal an ungodly amount of money from her in property taxes. And so I took some time off and came down and looked at the stuff they had been sending her and everything that it said. And then I started reading the statutes on taxation for property and so on and so forth. And I found out that how the county had been doing their tax assessments was absolutely unconstitutional and in violation of state law. And I went down and I confronted the county tax assessor about it, and he argued with me until I made the point that not only did I have enough money to take him to court, I had enough money to make sure I would win. And so he argued with me a little bit more, and I said, okay, that's fine. The place I will go to from here will be a lawyer, and we will set this up where you will be answering the questions I'm asking in a court of law instead of in your office. At that point, he agreed to sit down and reassess what was going on with the property taxes. He looked at it and he goes, okay, I see what the problem is. I understand what you're talking about. And so I will handle this and make sure that she gets an update on it. And then the next thing that my mother got in the mail was a notification that her property would no longer be subjected to the county property taxes.
Wow, that's a big win.
It is a big win because what I found out was that the property taxes in Texas, the Texas Constitution specifically forbids the state from levying ad valorem taxes on private property. And when you look at the actual tax code, it only taxes real property. And real property is property that is used for commercial purposes, such as apartment buildings and, department stores and stores themselves, things like that. They are not private homesteads. In fact, the Texas Constitution specifically exempts private homesteads from taxation entirely. The state has been allowing the counties and the municipalities to do the very thing the Constitution prohibits the state itself from actually doing, which is levying ad valorem taxes on private property. And after that, I was attacked by the Texas Comptroller in my private computer business for not charging and collecting state sales tax. And again, having gone through the tax code and understanding what sales tax actually was, I determined that I would not become an uncompensated tax collector for the state. And they took issue with that and tried numerous times to raid my business like I was the biggest drug lord in East Texas, and eventually drove me out of business by driving away all of my customers. And that's kind of the things that led up to me becoming an advocate for the actual law against those who enforce it arbitrarily and illegally.
I don't know. This is fascinating. I'm going to go back and watch the replay of what you're talking about. I'm just astonished. I know I had a computer consulting gig too. You wouldn't think about all the problems I'm having today. But yeah, it was like my services weren't taxable, but it was only when I sold, something, like a memory stick or a modem or something like that, that
Mm,
those were there. Oh my
now,
goodness.
well, on that note, may I interject?
Certainly.
See, here's the problem. If you're incorporated, you are correct. If you are not incorporated, then that is a presumption about being able to buy and sell your property being taxable is incorrect. I was not an incorporated computer business. I was a sole proprietor. The property I bought for use in my shop, whether I sold it or not, was my private property. Didn't belong to a company, it belonged to me. And I have the right to dispose of my property in any way I deem necessary or fit, including selling it to someone else. So in my shop, the way the Texas law is written, you are not allowed to ask for compensation for being a tax collector for the state. They basically ordered every business to serve as a tax collector without any compensation in the interest of the state. Well, under both the federal and the state constitution, that constitutes indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is when the state can dictate to anyone, or anyone else can dictate to anyone, that they have to work for them for free. They have to put up their own labor and their own money for the service of someone else against their will. And that's what the state of Texas is trying to do with every private sole proprietorship in Texas, is convert them into an indentured servant business by forcing them to be a tax collector for the state without compensation. And I refused to do that. And that's why they kept attacking me.
Nice. I mean, I'm saying nice to your principled stand.
No, I understand.
It's horrible that they were coming against you like that. But these behaviors and these attitudes, they seem to die hard in the people who are in power, and so it's kind of remarkable. I've given a lot of thought to this idea about incorporation and all this, and it seems to make your corporation really like a part of the state or the country.
Well, it is, because a corporation operates by legal privilege, not by legal right. Everything incorporated or corporation is a creature of law. As a creature of law, it is subject to all the legalese that goes with it. As a private individual working in your private capacity in an occupation of common right, doing what you have every right to do to sustain yourself and your family, you are not acting on a privilege. You are acting on a basic fundamental right to make a living for yourself and your family. And therein lies the distinction between the incorporated entities that do business within a state and the private individuals with their own private business.
And hopefully it's not a network issue. I mean, if I do run through a VPN, and I tried to reroute that to a closer state than where I'm at, or that didn't sound right.
No, that's okay. I use one as well, so
Yeah.
I understand the concept.
Yeah. Which one do you like to use?
I use NordVPN because they have no tracking logs on their servers.
That sounds good. I've been using private internet access for many years now. I get a little problems, reconnecting on my phone now and then, but keeps them
Nord,
from.
Yeah.
Keeps
I like
them
the Nord because it hosts a bunch of obfuscated servers and peer-to-peers and things like that. So when you need something specific, they've actually got it hosted in places all over the world. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an important thing. I think people should think about running VPNs, and in this day and age when they're tracking just about everything you do, everywhere you're operating from, it could be like, a month from now, you've said something in the past that was absolutely fine in the context of yesterday, but now 2 months from now, in that context, it's considered, by some extremists as treason or something, and then bam, They know right where you're at, where you operate. So you got all that stuff with the you went head to head with the property tax assessor, with the state comptroller or the county comptroller, state.
The state comptroller.
Wow. And how did that go? So that was the sales tax thing.
Yeah, the sales tax. Eventually, I just they scared away all of my customers to the point where I couldn't get any business. So I closed up the shop, moved to Austin, and I have been doing rule of law. I actually started being calling the folks at Rule of Law to try to get some information about how to deal with some of this, because this was before I became very astute at it. And talked to Randy for a while about these things, and studied and read and studied some more. And 8 months after my first call to them, I'd gone through this enough that I could write a dissertation on it, and I sent it to them. Randy read it and invited me to be a co-host on the show, and so I've been there ever since. And that was 2008.
Wow. Yeah. Fantastic. So what are some of the big wins that you think back on?
Well, some of the ones I'm most proud of, besides I help people with simple things usually when it comes to that, because fortunately, most of the people that I deal with, their troubles are fairly small: traffic tickets or probate court or some small matter in family law, something of that nature. But I've had a few big wins as well. I've had one 20 to life felony drug trafficking conviction attempt beat before it ever made it to court, and actually got 3 other people's conviction in the same matter overturned. And that's a big deal here in Texas right now. There is all kinds of news articles and everything else about that case that's going on right now. The main reason it happened was I have a friend who lives in San Antonio. Her name is Ruby Sandoval. And what happened was that through friends, she knew this guy who happens to be well known in San Antonio as a person who deals drugs, does a lot of criminal conduct, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he was also in secret, and unbeknownst to most of the people at the time, acting as a confidential informant for the San Antonio Bexar County Sheriff's Department. And their special drug task force used him to illegally plant drugs in people's houses, and then for the informant to report to them where they were hidden in the home so they could get a warrant and stage a raid. This is what they did to my friend Ruby. This guy planted 2.2 pounds of methamphetamine in her house by telling her that he had been kicked out of his apartment and he needed to store a few boxes from his apartment at her house till he found a new place. Well, within a few hours of him putting that stuff in her house, she was raided by the Bexar County Sheriff's Drug Task Force. They didn't search the house. They walked straight in the front door, put her in handcuffs, went straight to the specific room and the specific cardboard box where these drugs were located, pulled them out, took photos, charged her, and arrested her.
Wow.
This is exactly the scenario that took place for the 3 other people whose convictions we got overturned. The same guy did the same thing by going to their house, asking to use their bathroom, and then secreting drugs underneath the sink in their bathroom unbeknownst to them. Then went out, made his report to Bexar County that he had planted the drugs, and they performed a raid. Those 3 people all got sentenced to prison. They took plea deals and went to prison because of this confidential informant. One lady even died before she had health issues before she was sent to prison, and she died before her name could even get cleared after this was done. The other 2, however, are now in the same process that my friend Ruby is, in getting their names cleared, their records expunged, and their convictions have been overturned in full. Right now, that's very big news here in Texas. The other one I'm really proud of is I have another friend. His name is Pat Baker. He's ex-Air Force, retired. He's physically disabled as well. He's elderly. And in the county where he lives, they have the most corrupt judges, prosecuting attorneys, and sheriff's department that you've ever seen. They all work together to steal from all the residents of that county big time. Well, Pat was arrested and charged with felony evasion by use of a motor vehicle by a state trooper and several federal border patrol agents. What had happened is that in this county, one of the friends of Pat had been listening to the police scanner all day and had realized that the Texas Department of Public Safety and the Federal Border Patrol were cooperatively creating reasons to pull people over once they left a specific town. They were waiting for them outside of town to pull them over. The Border Patrol agents were and a DPS officer were, while they had other DPS in town monitoring the different roads out of that town and telling people a description, make, model, license plate of a car and what direction it was going on what road. And then they would set up a checkpoint outside of that and pull them over. They were practicing their drug interdiction on innocent people all that entire day. Pat was one of the victims they chose to perpetrate this on. Now, again, Pat, having had past experience with Border Patrol, breaking onto his fences, breaking into his buildings, threatening his family, trying to arrest him illegally, coming on his property unannounced, and just all kinds of things that are absolutely illegal, even for Border Patrol to be doing. So they kind of had it in for him. So when this DPS officer that was working with Border Patrol pulled in behind him and tried to pull him over, Pat was out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And in the county he lives in, pulling off the road is a threat to your safety simply because there are mesquite trees and everything all along the roads in that county. And you can get a mesquite thorn in a tire real easy and wind up being stuck with a flat. And Pat has no way to change a flat on a car because of his physical disability. And Border Patrol and DPS being what they are these days, they'd have left him stranded if he had gotten a flat out there on the side of the road. And he had no cell service, no nothing out where he lives. So he opted to try to get to some place where it was safe to pull over, which he was still several miles from when the DPS officer attempted to stop him. Now, granted, everyone in this county knows who Pat is. They know exactly who he is. They know his cars, including the van he was in that day. They knew exactly who they were trying to pull over. Well, eventually they put tire spikes in the road up in front of him. The Border Patrol did, blockaded the road, drew their guns, and were drawn down on him when he came down the road to their position. So he stopped. They hauled him out of the van, threw him face down on the pavement, and arrested him and charged him with felony evasion. Forget the fact that the stop itself was completely illegal. Okay, that's what they want to avoid, is announcing that, yeah, we were trying to illegally stop a guy and he wouldn't stop. So Pat was forced into a case where they tried to get an indictment against him in secret in violation of Texas law, charging him with a felony without an examining trial, which is a violation of Texas law. And the judges were aiding and abetting the prosecutor in perpetrating an illegal prosecution. Why? Because, one, in Texas, there are 3 steps to getting a prosecution initiated. First and foremost, there must be a sworn criminal complaint, which no one ever made against Pat. There was no sworn complaint in Pat's case, ever. Once the complaint has been sworn out, there has to be an information file by the prosecuting attorney's office. That information must then be attached to the complaint. And if it's a felony, they are then required to send it to a grand jury for an indictment. But before they can get to the information or indictment, the initial step immediately upon the filing of the complaint is the examining trial, where everything gets looked into by an independent magistrate. He looks into the allegation, the facts, the evidence, gets testimony from witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. And here in Texas, they have skipped all of that requirement for over 30 years. Even though it's written right into the law, it's got to be done, they don't do it. So I helped Pat by helping him write up legal pleadings and get them filed in his case. And before he actually got to trial, they kept him in limbo for almost a year and a half, if not more. But we finally filed a motion to dismiss with the district court there, and both district judges that heard it were in on this from the very beginning. And in that document, I called out names, I called out facts, dates, times, every law that those judges, the prosecuting attorney, and everyone else had violated, and the case law from Texas that showed they cannot proceed from where they're at. And at that point, they waved the white flag and dismissed Pat's case in full. And they did it without prejudice, or they did it with prejudice, so they could never, ever bring it back against him again.
But there's 30 years of people who are victims of this kind of criminal stuff.
That's correct.
And they need to be they need some kind of remedy.
Yes, they do.
For all this that's happened to their lives.
Yeah, and you're right. And the problem is you cannot get that remedy from the system that corrupted the system in the first place. And here in Texas, we have this problem, and in every state, really. It's my personal opinion that if you look at all the facts and evidence, the problems of the Constitution not being complied with and the rule of law breaking down to the extent it has can be laid squarely at the feet of the bar associations and the attorneys that run them. They are the cause, the sole root cause of every single violation of the Constitution and individual rights and the creation of laws in every state that allow this kind of stuff to happen. And it's intentional. There's no way to look at it and think it's not.
The Bar Association stands for British Accredited Registry. I've heard. Is that true?
You've heard. It's not true. I've actually spent a long time communicating with some barristers over in England about this very issue. They actually agreed to help and do the research. They've never heard the term ever. It doesn't appear in any English law or even an English history book. This is something that was cooked up by people that I have termed patronuts. Okay? They have patriotic intent, but nutty ideas and idiotic thoughts about how, and the processes as well, about how to fix it and how it began. They don't really read and understand things in a comprehensive manner. They'll read something, but what they get out of it is entirely different than what's actually written there when they learn to read it in the proper context. They'll read one thing instead of looking at the whole scheme of things it belongs within, its entire context. They will look at the one thing just like the courts themselves and the lawyers do, and they will isolate that from its surroundings and say, this is what it means because this is what it says. When in fact, if you put it back in context with all the things it's supposed to go with, the difference in what they think it says and what it actually says is worlds apart. It's not the same at all. And this is the biggest thing about what I try to teach on my show, is that when it comes to reading and understanding law, there is no one piece of law to do that. The statutory schemes across every state are written to function in the same manner. They are a mosaic. You will have one law in this code and one law in this code and a group of laws in this major code, which is basically the controlling code for the specific subject matter. And then you will have all these other codes that make satellite reference to or use parts of or integrate parts from that general code that applies to everything in depth. And those have to all be read as one complete body. And then you take that collective information and apply it to the specific facts and circumstances in front of you in order to properly understand what that law actually means and does. And this is something that attorneys and judges have gotten really, really, pardon my French, piss poor at for decades now. Law school does not teach an attorney the law. It teaches them procedure and only procedure. And they never, ever take the time after they graduate to actually read and study the published law. They only read some court's opinion about it. They don't ever read the actual statutes themselves unless they're forced to.
There's supposed to be some sort of that all the law in all the states, the statutes, the codes, and all this stuff is supposed to be harmonious. I've heard, and like you say, reading it in totality of the body of all the work, and that's where you're saying that it needs to be interpreted from.
Yes, and you are correct in the fact that they are supposed to be harmonious, but the difference there is how people interpret that word harmonious. They're supposed to be in harmony nationwide, and anywhere else that comes into play under specific state governed law, that the laws must not violate, first and foremost, the federal Constitution and the rights protected thereby. Second, they cannot violate their own state constitution and the rights protected thereby. In that way, every statutory scheme has to be harmonious. However, the specific statutes themselves will have their variances and their differences. Now, those differences by intent of the constitutions themselves and the right of liberty of the people are not supposed to be politically biased in how they're administered, which means a Democrat state shouldn't be able to do it this way and a Republican state do it that way when it comes to something that actually affects an individual right. In that regard, they're supposed to all be exactly the same because the right is exactly the same no matter where we are. And that, too, is a place where the courts have failed to properly understand and administer the Constitution and justice. So given that, it makes sense when you think about it that certain statutory schemes have to differ from place to place because the facts and circumstances of living in that place will be different. For instance, the transportation code statutes on how particular types of vehicles must be driven and parked and equipment for braking and snow and ice and all that will be different in places like Colorado versus Texas because the landscape, the weather, the geography in general makes all of that a different set of requirements depending upon the time of year. Here in Texas, it's pretty much the same everywhere until you get up toward the Texas Panhandle, where now it becomes an issue where you have to be more like what you would be in Colorado or northern Arkansas. Okay, the road condition, the weather conditions, they affect things differently than they do in the southern part of Texas. So it makes sense that from place to place, the statutes could be somewhat different for certain things for those reasons. But when it comes to us as individuals and our rights, they are supposed to be harmonious no matter where we live.
What about the I used to listen a lot to Mark Stevens, and he would get his approach for defending someone against government encroachment would be that when they accuse you of violating a law, you ask them questions and keep digging down until you get to the question, how what evidence do you have to prove that the laws and constitution and such apply just because you're inside of a geographic boundary? Mm-hmm. Have you heard this before?
I'm very familiar with Mark Stevens, yes. And I spent a lot of time reading the stuff that he wrote and listening to him on his show. And he makes sense up to a given point. Okay. That given point being when you talk about the forming of societies. Okay. Society as a whole can't function in chaos. It simply can't. And the fact of that is evidenced right now with the defund the police movement. As these Democrat cities have started taking money away from the cops and they've gotten less and less police, the population's gone completely berserk. There's rioting, there's theft. I mean, they're even to the point now where you can walk out of a store in broad daylight carrying the most expensive item the store sells and not pay for it And no one is going to stop you walking out the door, not even the cops.
Wow.
Because the prosecutors in those states have deemed we will not allow prosecution for these types of offenses. We're just not going to do it.
And is this Texas you're talking about?
No, this is all over. This is in mostly Democrat-controlled states, okay? Believe it or not. It's mostly Democratic-controlled states, but it has happened in multiple places. There are certain cities, even within Republican-run states, where they're doing the same thing, where they got a Democratic mayor or a Democratic city manager or a Democratic prosecutor.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is getting to be widespread, this defund the police movement, up until the point where the crime gets completely out of control. This is proof positive that given their own devices, more people will choose to do what's best for them rather than society if given the opportunity, especially when they feel like they have a right to be vindicated for past harms that they may or may not have actually suffered.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's that mindset that makes government in general necessary at all. The entire premise of government was not to rule over the people or to dictate their lives. The primary premise of government when it was first created was to provide a means for the people to use their collective power to protect the rights of each other. By forming a society that would mutually benefit all of them to protect their rights and property from encroachment by others. For instance, an individual against a mob doesn't stand a chance, but an entire society against a mob, that's a whole different matter. Okay? So the general principle of government was to protect us for those reasons and through that means. So when you say that, how do you say that this applies to me? Well, one, you decided to be a functioning member of society. And that means that you interact with that society. Whether you choose to live in it and conform to it is another question. But when you interact with it or in any way and in any part, then you are subject to the rules that go with that. There's no way around that. This is exactly how corporations function when they contract with people who don't work specifically and directly for the corporation. Yes, we will hire you to do this job for us as long as you agree to follow these rules that we have for how we run our corporation. Okay. And the society basically functions in the same way. You want our protection and our services for these things, then we've got certain rules you've got to comport yourself with in order to receive that. And that in general, I have no problem with. It's when they go beyond the protection mechanism to the you must do mechanism that I have a problem with it, especially when what I must do serves no benefit to me, but only to the entity itself or to someone who has no right to it, in my opinion. Because you're taking from me to give to them against my will, that's not society. That's theft in any form, no matter what label you attach to it. So I spent a lot of time digging into stuff like Mark Stevens and all these other things. There's all kinds of schemes running around out there in the legal world and the patriot world that people need to be very, very, very wary of. There's accepted for value, the birth certificate BS, the straw man BS, all of this stuff. These are theories that have been cooked up off a single grain of rice in the bowl with nobody bothering to show how that grain relates to all the other rice in the bowl. Okay, they just refuse to do that. They want to take that one grain in isolation and say, this is all there is to this. There is no more. And that's just not the way it works. And so they've concocted these theories, again, in my opinion, so that they can make themselves feel like they understand the problem, when in fact they are even further away from understanding the problem because they're substituting their opinion for the actual facts. And the biggest problem with them is their facts are based upon multiple levels of inference. And in the world I work in, the actual world of law and the legal, you are only allowed one level of reasonable inference from a given fact. For instance, fact, you drop a bowling ball off the top of a building. reasonable inference. It will travel in a downward direction at a high rate of speed until it collides with something that alters its trajectory or it crushes. Okay, that's a reasonable level of inference from that one single fact. But their levels go like this. You drop the bowling ball. Well, if there's a gust of wind coming from the left, it's liable to take flight in an easterly direction, since that's the direction the wind is traveling, and it could actually hit the ground 5 blocks that away, hit a manhole, roll through that manhole, come out of culvert down on the far end of the street, blow into the side of a Mini Cooper, knock it into a ditch, kill the person driving, and you're responsible.
I get your point about the multiple levels of inference. Yeah. Yeah, I see that. I see people making, huge leaps in
logic and reason.
Yeah. Uh-oh, I got to plug my laptop in. It says I have 11 minutes left.
Well, at least you've been steady this time. You haven't gone spinning dial on me in a while.
Yeah.
But that could happen real quick if you run out of power.
We have power. So that's good. Blow my nose here. Excuse me. Yeah, some kind of cold or something's trying to get me. But I've been working on that real good. Yeah. Wow. So, I've been down a lot of those rabbit holes you've been talking about, the accepted for value, and I still send stuff into the IRS now and then, just hoping against hope that they'll pay it. And I haven't had any. I mean, I have one friend who said he got his father's $5,000 credit card cleared. And
see, that's the thing about those types of things is there's always somebody that knows somebody, but nobody that can actually produce something from the alleged receiver of that information that shows without a doubt what you sent us is valid. And so we're agreeing to do what you're asking us to do. And here it is.
Yeah.
There is no chain of evidence that I have ever seen from anyone that proves what they did was what caused whatever result they're claiming they received, or that they actually got the result they're claiming to have received. People often tell me, well, I haven't heard from the IRS in 10 years. And that proves what exactly? That you've moved 7 times in 10 years and didn't leave a forwarding address? What is that supposed to prove that you haven't heard from them in 10 years? Okay. Well, I sent this in. Okay. Again, what proof do you have that the IRS took what you wrote and said, oh, you're right. Here's what we're going to do about it. Where's your evidence? And they never have it. They just make that leap of presumption from those other inferences that they're sitting pretty because A didn't result in D. And that's a logic I have yet to ever been able to develop. As a programmer, the first thing I learned is there are procedures to writing a program. And every step has to work in a perfect logical flow to get the results you want. If it doesn't go in the same logical flow it needs to, now you can write that flow, that step any way you want, as long as the result you get is the one that you wanted it to have. But the flow itself has to be the same. Step 1, step 2, step 3, then your result. Without that, the program will not produce the result with consistency that you're expecting it to produce. And the same thing in law. There's a certain procedure for everything. Now, the steps may be different from place to place as far as what's within that procedure, but there's still a procedure. This state may have this document. This state may have that form. This state may require you to write the letter or the document or the form, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, the procedure still basically remains the same. And the steps have to be followed to make that procedure reach its fruitful point. And this is where most people, when it comes to reading and understanding law, fail. They fail because they read things in isolation, they analyze them in isolation, and therefore they understand them only in isolation. And then when they try to put it together with the rest of what's going on, there is no little round hole to fit the peg in that they carved out in a triangle shape. It just won't go in the hole. Yes, I do very simplistic analogies, but
one friend of mine, he'd been looking at this stuff all this time, about how to like take control of your straw man or something, and he figured out to just use the patent office to do a service mark on your name. So
which the courts have already held case law on that says you cannot copyright a name. It doesn't work that way.
It's
unless you're using it in an actual commercial enterprise. You can copyright a likeness, you can copyright many things, but you cannot copyright a name.
Well, it's a service mark, and
even that, you can't trademark an individual name, a person's name. You cannot trademark it. Like I said, you can trademark their likeness, you can trademark their autograph, you can trademark a lot of things, but the case law specifically says you cannot copyright or trademark an individual name. Can't do it.
Huh. Well, maybe we should punish this patent office for issuing me one.
Well, the patent office just assumes you know what you're asking for.
Ah.
They're not assuming you're asking for something that's human to be trademarked. They're thinking you're asking for some negotiable item or instrument of value to be trademarked that the courts agree fall within that category. And the courts do not agree that an individual's name falls within that category of thing. And therein lies the problem.
Yeah, we'll see.
Now ask your friend this. When has he ever collected one dime off of his alleged mark?
Oh, like from someone using it in,
yes.
Yeah, I guess that would be the next thing is charging fees for improper use of it, or not.
Yeah, which no court would give him the money for. If someone refused to pay and he tried to sue him, the court would rule against him. Guaranteed they'd rule against him. Because like I said, there's already established case law on the books that says, sorry, it doesn't work that way.
Well, I don't know exactly what it is about the case, the matter against me in California, in Bakersfield. But recently, they've started erasing my case from their history and from the current caseload. It's really old. It was from 2009. And so maybe they have a limitation how long it can stay on the books.
Well, yeah, there's a statute of limitations on any thing like that, whether it be civil or criminal. The question is what the state law says about how the statute of limitations runs. See, here in Texas, they have, depending upon the level of the offense, let's just say a misdemeanor, for instance. Here in Texas, misdemeanors, they have a maximum time limit in the statute of limitations of 2 years to file the actual criminal complaint. However, once the complaint has been filed with a court, you can be in limbo forever waiting for them to prosecute it. That's the way the law in Texas is currently written. I don't believe that's valid. But here's the thing. Texas also has court opinions that state that in certain cases, like a Class C misdemeanor, which is a fine-only misdemeanor here in Texas, which is basically a civil infraction in any other state. But for many states, these are actual criminal cases, like traffic and so on and so forth. Here, they're criminal. But once that complaint has been filed, since the case law ignores the actual statutory law and does not require a proper prosecuting attorney to file an information or get an indictment, despite the fact the Constitution and the statutes both say they must, they just charge you and prosecute you based upon the complaint all by itself. Unless you agree that they can use just the citation as the complaint all by itself, in which case they consider that a waiver of the actual written complaint. But in either way, they've got 2 years to file that document, And then once it's filed, they only have 4 to 5 months, unless you've asked for a continuance as the defendant, to prosecute that case from the moment the complaint's actually filed. Otherwise, you've been denied in your right to a speedy trial, and they have failed to properly prosecute the case. Now, why that doesn't work for many types of other cases is beyond me, because for them to be able to hold a case over your head forever makes no sense, especially when it's a low-level offense. But here in Texas, legitimately, under the law, they can do it. And that's one of the things that I'm working on getting legal reform about here in Texas, is that the statute of limitations not only applies to the filing of the actual complaint, it should apply to the prosecution of the offense under that complaint.
That would be nice.
And if you can't do that, then you need to stop charging people for BS and only charge them for what matters. Murder, robbery, mugging, things of that nature. Stop going for the revenue and start going for the justice.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had a case in Wisconsin. It goes way back. I was out on the street with a "Have a nice day" sign, like a sandwich sign strapped to me, and I'm waving at cars. I was unemployed, didn't have anything better to do. Thought it would help the economy, everybody get in a better mood, and they did. I mean, they were contacting the newspaper saying, this guy's just really brightening our day. And then one day when the newspaper reporter comes out to do a story on me, I let him know I was going to run against Paul Ryan in the congressional election, and as a write-in candidate. And then I went and did it in another jurisdiction outside the place where I knew I knew the police chief in the town, but out in the county, I didn't know these enforcers out there and stuff. And I was doing it in front of one of Paul Ryan's fundraisers out on the street. And well, anyway, the short of it is, took a year before the trial. The trial happened, or the trial date came, and the district attorney wasn't ready, and he asked for an extension. And I didn't know I could demand right then that they drop.
You could object to the extension and say, they've had time to prepare. Why aren't they ready? I move for a dismissal.
Dismissal, that's it. And but I didn't know this stuff, and I was trying to listen to shows, like yours and stuff, and talk to friends, and all these ideas and stuff were out there, and I had no experience of it, and plus I was traumatized by the case, which makes it really hard to function. And so, it went on and on, kept getting other hearings, but eventually, there's other parts I could talk about this, but I want to say that eventually there was a bench warrant because I didn't appear. It was a failure to appear. And I sent in a notice of non-appearance, and that, I was done with it. And I left town that day, left the state. And so eventually that became a bench, or they issued a bench warrant for me back then. And I think it's still in place to this day. And then about 7 years ago, about 7 years ago, it starts showing up on my credit report, and the creditors start calling me about, this money and stuff. And I'm like, on principle, I'm not going to ever pay this. And I issued a rescission of my signature from all the bail bonds, and such. So, you're collecting on something that's invalid. And, but anyway, this has stopped me from having a career in my, in systems administration work for like since about 2005. And, I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss of how to deal with it.
Well, what was the actual charge?
Oh, obstructing, he asked me to give him my driver's license, or not to give him, to show him my driver's license. So I held it up and I showed it to him, but he went to take it and I held it fast. And I said, I don't wish to surrender it. I'm afraid I might not get it back. And then he goes all Barney Fife trying to get what ended up being pepper spray. And I thought it was a taser. So I stood in my place 3 seconds and I said, don't tase me. And I stood in my place 3 seconds. And then I started running because at that time I'd heard about 300 people that died from tasers. And so then, he catches up to me and, tries
Were
to.
you in a car at the time?
I was standing on the side of the road. I had a car near me with the hazard lights on because, I just didn't want, I thought it should be visible that the car's there. I didn't want anybody to hit it, but it was off the road. It was, it wasn't going to be a problem. And the plates were expired by about 10 days, something like that, something I didn't know. And he came by the first time and he left, said everything was okay. And then he came by a second time because his boss had told him to get my ID. Well, the sign said, "Have a nice day" on the front. On the back, it said Joseph William Baker in really big letters. And then in tiny stuff, for Congress, paid for by Joseph William Baker. And then in the report, he lies and says that I told him my name was Thomas Baker. It was my first time getting exposed to the idea that that the police would lie in the report in order to get a conviction or to even seem reasonable. And
there's a specific reason the Supreme Court said it's perfectly legitimate for states to hire police officers based upon their IQs. And that's why so many low IQ individuals were chosen for the job. They don't want people that can think. They want people that will follow orders. And so, yeah, they'll definitely lie at any given opportunity because it's their career that's on the line for what they do. Their promotions are based upon the number of arrests, the number of convictions, complete investigations, et cetera, et cetera. So this scheme of self-promotion by intruding upon the rights of others is what makes policing in the good old US of A what it is today, a police state. And these are the things that we've got to change. We've got to make it where their ability to get promoted and to be awarded for doing a good job has absolutely no relationship with the arrests they make, what kind of arrests they are, how much they were valued at, et cetera, et cetera. We have to completely disassociate those two things. Otherwise, it will always be about the revenue generation over justice.
I get what you're saying. And then it bothered me because in the newspaper, I would see this sheriff that had arrested me. I'd see him getting awards and stuff. And wow, that just blew me away. I couldn't really do much about it until about 2005 when I lost a job. I was offered a job contingent on a background check, and it failed because of this ordeal in Wisconsin. And
Wisconsin or California?
I've had instances in California, Wisconsin, and Utah.
Same type of stuff?
No, all very different. Wisconsin is the first one, and that was the "Have a nice day" sign. I mean, that even got in the newspaper. So it was so ridiculous. The newspaper reporters can't help but write up on a story. That's so bizarre. This guy's "Have a nice day" ended up with being handcuffed and pepper sprayed. but it's this one in Wisconsin that has showed up on the background checks and caused me to not get this job in Silicon Valley. It was like $100,000 a year, and and I knew them. They were my client in the data center I worked at out there. So it was a big move up for me from 85,000 to 100, and and I hadn't gotten a raise in 3 years, but all the prices of everything were going up. So yeah, this is a problem, and I've gotten to where I'm kind of in fear for my life in dealing with police officers or going to courts and stuff like that. Because in Bakersfield, they actually stomped on my head and clubbed me 15 times. Now, I did, after they clubbed me 15 times, that's when I tipped over the officer.
They must have thought your name was Rodney King.
Yeah, well, it wasn't too far. Bakersfield isn't too far from Los Angeles. And I've often thought about it, that how the case, is similar to the Rodney King thing. And that, heck, I should be seeing a $50 million check from them. But yeah, that's. Oh, Antivax says, you're the most knowledgeable person I've seen talk about this subject. You make perfect sense. Thank you. Thank you for being on here, Eddie.
Well, thanks for having me.
Greta says, very interesting discussion. Yeah. I'm not in control of the whole broadcast right now. I've switched over browsers for stability purposes. But since I started it in the Brave browser, that's the one that has the cookie to control everything. But yeah, it's been a big quest of how to get remedy and how to hold them accountable. And when I say accountable, I don't necessarily even mean that they have to pay, but I mean that they have to be confronted with the price tag of their damages and own up to the fact that they've caused this much damage in society. And now, when you say about the Bar Association, makes me think, it's a concerted effort to destroy America. But there I'm doing levels of inference.
Well, the thing is you're right. I've got a saying, and that is that the government is very good at taking your time, your money, and your house and your other property. But what it will never take is responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you what you think, the solution is moving forward from here.
Well, honestly, my idea of a solution is everything has to begin locally. The way our government is designed, our government is not a trickle-down government, it's a trickle-up government. Everything begins locally when it comes to your government and the people responsible for making sure the government is run properly in the service of the people rather than itself and for those that are invested in it. So given that, we should get to know the people that we're putting into office at every level of government. We know them not simply because they're on TV or we hear them on YouTube or whatever. We know them because they're actually our friends, our neighbors, people from our neighborhood. Okay. We know them through people. We know other people's people because we know those people in the surrounding towns, etc. By getting to know what's going on locally and making sure that only those that you trust to do the job right and are doing the job right are allowed to remain, we begin the trickle up process. Right now, we've become a very disinterested society. We feel that the entire system is so corrupt, it's better just to turn our back and walk away from it than to try to fix it. In some ways, that's true, but in others, that's a catastrophic decision. The reason for it is because you have to kind of look at the government we have as a permanent fixture rather than an erector set that will fall apart without regular maintenance. The permanent fixture aspect of it is it's in place whether we like it or not. So the only thing to do with it is to ensure that the proper people are in the proper place within that system to maintain that part of it the way it's supposed to be done. If we fail to do that, we get what we have right now. An absolutely unstable, corrupt, irreconcilable mess run by utter morons.
Yeah.
Therein lies our biggest problem. The morons are in charge. People who've never had a real job, or if they've had, they've used that job to steal from others for their own gain. And I am talking about the lawyers and the judges and the bar associations. Because when you look at how this works, let me give you a perfect example of how Texas government is organized here. In 1939 is when the State Bar Act for the state of Texas was enacted. In 1939, the practice of law was put into private hands by a government act. Okay? It gave bar card carrying lawyers the only legitimate access to the system that we have. It also gave them complete and utter control of an entire branch of the people's government, the judicial branch. There is not a single office of real power, decision-making power, in the entire judicial department of the state of Texas that is not controlled by a bar card member. Not one. The same thing holds true for every other branch of our state government. Our governor is a lawyer. Our lieutenant governor is a lawyer. The speakers of both houses of the legislature are lawyers. One house of the legislature in 1939 was 89% lawyers. The other house was 49% lawyers. When the State Bar Act was brought up for vote in 1939, the state constitution forbade that 89% of members of one house and the 49% of the other house from voting on that bill because they had a direct personal interest in that bill's outcome becoming law. The Texas Constitution forbade them to vote on that bill. 100% of that 89 and 49 voted in approval of that bill. Why? Because it gave them a private monopoly on the practice of law. It ensured that their livelihood could not be taken away for almost any reason whatsoever, because it was now protected by the state and the awesome police power of the state, which they, as judges and lawyers, actually controlled. So they have given themselves all this power through the State Bar Act, and now they have infiltrated and taken over multiple branches of Texas government. And here is where the big caveat lies. Here in Texas, our state constitution has a specific article and clause that forbids, and it's Article 2, Section 1, it forbids any member of any office or branch of government from exercising any power or authority belonging to any other member of any other office or branch of state government. So how does that affect what I'm talking about? Well, it affects it like this.
Can you say that again?
Article 2, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution is the separation of powers clause. It specifically prohibits any person within any office or branch of government from exercising any power and authority belonging to any person or office of any different branch.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the State Bar Act is codified here in Texas law under Chapter 82 of the Texas Government Code. Under Chapter 82, it specifically states that the state bar is enacted and created as an administrative office of the judicial branch of government.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Now, as an administrative office, every member of that office is a de facto judicial officer limited to activities within the judicial department of government.
Right.
However, there's another problem. Their ability to practice law is not a license. It is that membership card in the state bar. Texas and no other state issues a license to practice law. They issue a card to be a member of the bar association. And as an administrative office of the judicial department of government, anyone that's a member of that office is a judicial department officer. Okay?
Officer of the court.
They're a judicial officer, not just of the court, but of the entire judicial department of government.
Okay.
Now, given that, they now have a constitutionally illegal monopoly on the practice of law and use their public office for their own private and personal gain. That bar card is what allows them to stuff their pockets with money.
Yeah.
Okay? So not only do they steal from us through this unconstitutional monopoly in Texas, they now go and become members of other branches of government while still having an active bar card. And they can't do that. It is absolutely unconstitutional. I've got an entire legal white paper I wrote up on that subject. I've actually got copies of the original legislation, a copy of the actual signatures and votes cast on the bill by those lawyers that were in the House of Representatives and the Senate at the time. It shows how the entire bill was absolutely illegal in its enactment. Absolutely illegal. And yet every time they have the Sunset Commission meeting downtown in Austin, and I go down and I challenge their ability to not sunset the Bar Association, they refuse to do the necessary research. They say, we'll go see if there's any legal precedent. Legal precedent has nothing to do with this. This is what the state constitution says. Legal precedent does not trump what the state constitution says. And the legislature cannot create a statute that supersedes what the Constitution says, especially when that legislature was controlled by the very people that benefit directly from the legislation, financially and personally in every way.
Wow. Were all those state bar associations created around that 1939 time?
They were probably. I don't know that for certain, since the bar's been around since, I think, the late 1800s as a general idea. But it was never intended that the bars be controlling over the practice of law, only that the person doing so was in good standing, as in they knew and understood the law, not that they had to be specifically educated or degreed in the law with a Juris Doctorate in order to be a lawyer. And the fact of the matter is that Juris Doctorate is toilet paper. And the proof of that is simply by putting a law book in front of an attorney and saying, read this and tell me what it says. And he'll read that one thing, and he won't bother to look and see if there's anything else that affects what he's reading and decide what it means without going any further. That right there is proof positive he is not qualified to have that bar card. He is not qualified to represent somebody in a court of law because he doesn't actually know the law. He only knows some other lawyer's opinion about the law.
Like you said earlier, they know about the process. They're trained in the process, and then they have to learn. They have to study and see how it connects to everything else in the law. Later, the bar card is not something that tells them that that is evidence that they know the law.
No, it's a dues membership card to a club. That's all it is. It's a club card, like Sam's Club.
Wow. The way you say this, it reads almost like G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Isle, where the banks were taken over.
Yeah, there's so much law that people fail to apply. They replace it with opinion and policy rather than what the law actually says. For instance, in reference to the banks, did you know that the banks are actually prohibited by federal law from demanding a social security number from an American citizen to open an account?
Yes.
Okay.
My friend told me that. He told me about it's in the Social Security code. It's not meant to be an identification number.
Your friend's got that incorrect. He's right in that the fact that it's not supposed to be an identification number. In fact, the original cards that were first issued when it came out, I remember seeing my grandfather's Social Security card back when I was a kid, and stamped right across the front of it in red ink, it said, "Not an ID." It said it right on the Social Security card. And that's the lie they told the public to get it passed. We'll never use it for an identification number. Never, ever. And that's exactly what they turned it into. But the key to understanding what I said was about the banks not being able to demand it has nothing to do with the Social Security Act itself. The Social Security Act specifically says a Social Security number is not required to be acquired by any American. We're not required to have one. Never have been. Never will be. The law I'm talking about is the Privacy Act of 1974, which specifically makes it a crime and a civil tort for any federal or state institution or entity that's regulated by either to require a Social Security number to engage in that entity's services unless that entity had a mandatory procedure for that number in place prior to 1975. And they didn't. No one did, because it was not intended to ever be used that way. The second set of laws,
The Privacy Act, that was the Privacy Act of 1954, you said?
74.
Right? Oh, 1974. Okay.
Yes. And the other set of laws specifically goes to the banks directly, and it's in the internal, I think it's the Internal Revenue Code, but in any case, it specifically says how the bank is to handle bank accounts for which there is no taxpayer ID number, which is what the SSN is used for, is a taxpayer ID number. For accounts that are open without a taxpayer ID number, the law specifically states the bank must ask for the number. But if the number is not provided, the bank is then required to simply list that account on a specific report if that report is ever requested by the Secretary of the Treasury that says, here's all of our accounts that are not associated with any kind of taxpayer ID. And that's it. That's all that report has on it. Here's the list of accounts with no taxpayer ID. And so by putting a Social Security number into an account, they're literally putting you in peril with the IRS. Because when you put a tax ID number on a bank account, you are signifying that all the funds that are going into that account are in fact taxable, when in fact they are not, if you're an American citizen living and working within the several states of the Union. Americans' income can only be taxed if it's coming from outside of the United States. And you're bringing it back into the United States. The only other person that the tax code specifically says that it applies to as far as taxable income is what's defined in law as a U.S. person. And a U.S. person is not defined as an individual living and working in the U.S. A U.S. person is actually a foreign individual or corporation as defined by federal tax law.
Wow.
So when people start trying to argue about why do I have to pay income taxes, or my straw man don't pay income taxes, or I'll accept for value income taxes, that's why these people are going to federal prison, because they aren't reading the law. The law makes it very clear, albeit it is written to confuse intentionally. If you will muddle through it and you will connect the dots properly, you will find the picture that it draws lays everything out in a way that is irrefutable. I have a good friend. His name is Dave Champion. He wrote a book called Income Tax: Shattering the Myth. And you can find that book and his W-4 and W-9 payroll management book on his website at drreality.news. Now, Dave is ex-Special Forces. He is one of the most intelligent men you will ever meet in your life. He can go toe-to-toe on virtually any subject with anybody you would ever want to talk about or to. He is absolutely astounding in his level of knowledge about damn near everything. Now, to look at him, I call him Mr. Clean because Dave's got a ball-shaved head. He's very muscular. He's actually 66 years old now, I think, 65 or 66. But you wouldn't know it by looking at him. He's covered in tattoos, which he's only started collecting for the last few years or so. He didn't used to have the number of tattoos he's got now, but he does. But people tend to look at him, and just based upon his appearance from the tattoos, they tend to just shrug him off as somebody who's just making stuff up. That would be a very, very big mistake. His level of knowledge on the income tax is unbounded. And there is not a person on this planet that would stand a snowball's chance in hell of standing there and arguing the tax code with him and winning. Nobody. There's not a tax attorney in existence that could do it. And everything that he explains to you in his book and in the videos he's done over the years about his book and the information in it is exactly what the law, the federal treasury decisions, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Attorney General opinions, all of these things that come together to prove everything that he's laid out in his book. And he does not go the multiple level of inference route. Every single legal point he makes, he points you to the specific statute, opinion, court opinion, Attorney General opinion, rule, regulation, or information put out by the IRS or the Secretary of State themselves that specifically supports everything he says in his book. And his goal is to get people to understand that the income tax, despite what everybody wants to think, the income tax is the biggest financial fraud to ever be perpetrated on any country, anywhere. And it is the biggest financial scheme the US of A has ever run afoul of. Because every single penny the government has ever taken from an American citizen living and working in the US has been absolutely illegal, or would have been, had it not been for the fact that that person was misled by misrepresentation of the facts and the law into believing they were someone who they was subject to the income tax. And that is where most people make their biggest mistake when it comes to law and legal assumptions and presumptions. They will hang you out to dry more often than they will save you. Everything that's said and done in law needs to have supporting evidence, or it's simply an opinion. Any decent judge would tell you that. But there are no decent judges either. So here we are having to teach ourselves on how to fend and fight for ourselves, because the attorneys are not here. They're just like doctors. Finding a cure for a disease does not benefit the doctor, ever. Keeping his patients alive and coming back is what benefits the doctor. The same thing holds true for the attorneys and the judges. If I taught you what the law actually was and how to understand it, I wouldn't have any work because you wouldn't need me. That's their greatest fear, and it is their greatest loss of control.
Wow. Well said, Eddie.
I've had lots of time to practice.
Yeah, you have. I've been working on a system, a remedy. You know, remember how they used to talk about the instead of the king being the ruler, that the law is the ruler, but Lex Rex they called it or something.
Mm-hmm.
What about if we go back on only instead of the king being ruler, the individuals are the ruler? And
well, that's what this country was founded to be. The individuals are the rulers. See, this is what I was going back to earlier about the purpose of actual government being what it is to protect each individual in their individual sovereignty, their right to be left alone, unhindered and uninhibited, unless they use their right to act that way to infringe upon the rights of another, at which point the purpose of government is invoked, and the person who received the harm from your acts or someone else's acts now has a way to obtain remedy for that harm. That's what government was intended to do, to protect our ability to obtain remedy and protect what is ours. It was never intended to dictate what we could or couldn't do with it outside of using it to harm the person or property of another, period. And that is where the biggest failing of government and the people have come into play. We have failed ourselves. We want to blame government and those in it for everything, when in fact the blame can be laid squarely at our own feet. When we become disinterested in how our government functions and what it's doing, then it's free to do what it likes because there's no one to hold it accountable. There's no one to answer to. This is why they act so shocked and work so hard to suppress it when people finally wake up and start to do that. It's why the FBI was told to go after parents who were showing up at school meetings and protesting against this grooming of children for all these other things, as well as critical race theory and all this other crap they're trying to push upon us as fact and functionality. It just doesn't work. But this is the things that government is left to do on its own when we become disinterested in how it works and who's in control of it. Okay? Imagine how things would be if you wrote rules for your house for your children and you posted them on the wall and you said, okay, now this is the initial set of rules, but from this day forward, children, you are free to change the rules as you see fit. You can write them any way you want. You can change what's in them any way you want. You can say or do anything you want as long as you write it down. How well do you think things would function with your kids once that was put into place?
Well, there would be a period of turbulence. But I think eventually it might become another source of organic law where out of experience of figuring out what works and what doesn't work, they start to establish a track record and probably go back into the original more of the original laws than the ones that and then there's the problem as you said earlier about like the Bar Association being motivated by profit, their own income and protecting their monopoly. That seems to be a corrupting force in our society too. When you couple the income with the force of government monopoly creation. So I don't know. I think there's some chaos to answer you, and I think that's what you're looking for about the kids being able to make their own rules. But with time and experience, I think things swing back and forth like a pendulum.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because it is my belief and understanding of history that is exactly the point the founding fathers reached when they created our Constitution in the first place. They had it up to their eyebrows with the unruly children in the house, messing it up, doing what they wanted, and making a mess of everything. So based upon those experiences, they went back and wrote it all down to say, here's where we should be willing to limit ourselves. And that is what government will never, ever do on its own. It will never limit itself to anything. Its sole purpose for existence is to gain more power with each passing day. Okay? Now, that is that initial state of turmoil you're talking about when you give the children the power to change that document you put on the wall the first time. You are giving them the ability to create that very same turmoil. Now, if your children actually learn from those experiences and decide to basically go back to the original, do you think they're also going to include the instruction that you gave them about how they can now change it?
No. I get your
Exactly.
point.
Exactly. And this is a lot of what I see with the Patronut community and the Mark Stevens approach when you're talking about throwing the rules out the frickin' window and saying that ain't what I want to do no more. You're opening that Pandora's box for that period of turmoil that always results from that lack of control. Human beings, being what they are, have a boundless spirit. And that boundless spirit has a lot of ways it can go. Okay?
Yeah.
Good, bad, and ugly. It has a lot of ways it can go. And because it's boundless in what it can perceive as right and wrong, and areas of gray that are acceptable versus not acceptable, then without some sort of structural limitations upon how that can be inferred and applied, you're looking at that period you were thinking of. All that chaos that's going to be kicking in because of it. And it's only when you crawl out the other side, scarred and battle-fried, that you're going, I wish we hadn't done that. Well, to me, that's where the founding fathers found themselves when they decided to leave England. And now we've given the children the permission to write on the walls, and here we are.
Oh, boy. Yeah. I think the thing that I remember Mark Stevens talking about was not so much that there wouldn't be rules, but that there wouldn't be rulers, or like not a separate class.
Yeah, but again, what are we calling a ruler? See, this is the one thing about Mark Stevens I've never, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but on that train of thought, I tend to latch on to things as they go by me. My brain just kind of functions that way.
Right, it works.
But the Mark Stevens approach is that when you say that we want rules but no rulers, well, who are we expecting to enforce the rules? And why are rulers anything other than rule enforcers rather than rulers? I mean, what is the actual meaning of rule enforcer if it's not ruler, someone who applies the rules? Okay, so you can't have one and not have the other, because either society as a whole has to band together to enforce the rules, which means every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the neighborhood has to join the party and the posse when it comes time to do something, or they gather a select group of people to go and handle the situation as the posse, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's the situation we're in. It's all or nothing according to Mark Stevens, yet that's not the way our society functions. It's some on behalf of all that we've established this set of rules and the ability to enforce them. And we put that power in the hands of some. You follow?
The part that becomes the problem, not that there aren't necessarily enforcers, let's see, but it's the problem is when the enforcers are not subject themselves to the rules.
But that's the thing. That's when society needs to come together and outnumber the enforcers and apply the rules equally. When the enforcers will not enforce upon themselves, that's when it becomes our responsibility as a people to enforce it ourselves. But once again, we would rather be lazy and apathetic. And by the way, folks, in case you hadn't done the math, apathetic, I think, is like 89% pathetic. All right. That to me is what that word has always meant. But if you're going to be apathetic, you're going to get what you deserve out of the things that you build and create. It's that simple. And we've created a government that is drunk on its own power. And we are doing nothing as a people to stand together, united, and bring it back under control. We let it set its own rules and come up with ways to divide us. And then we swallow those divisionary things, hook, line, and sinker in groups. And so as the saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. They know this saying very, very well. This is exactly what they're putting into practice. They are dividing so that we will fall.
Yes. Yes. I've done something. I don't know if you had a chance to look at forgivenesspubliclicense.org.
I hadn't heard of it until you just now mentioned it.
Oh, it's something I wrote, and it's and I won't jump into it real deep unless you're real curious. It's about the premise of having bilateral agreements to forgive and be forgiven by another person. So I got this friend Star, and she and I agreed to do this. And when we forgive, we can create a financial asset that outlines what the damage was and how much the value is, and then we can put it to like a cryptocurrency or something like that. That's the principle of forgiveness public license, that we can offset our damages by when we forgive them, we create an asset worth the value of the forgiveness. So we can do something with it financially down the road. It's probably a long shot that that it'll ever get that much traction, but I'm all about long shots in the like the crypto markets and stuff. So,
well, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
And not meaning to rain on your parade, it's just something that pops into my head again, the way my brain works, being a programmer.
Yep.
The reason I was so good at it was the first thing I noticed is how the code is going to mess up the rest of the program when I'm writing a function or subroutine. So when you say that individuals get together to create a forgiveness that has a particular asset value to it, how do you prevent fraud upon the system? Let's say you and I decide that we're going to mutually harm each other, and that within we're going to agree that our mutual harm will be resolved by multi-trillion-dollar agreement between each other.
Yeah.
And thus we create a multi-trillion-dollar asset that we control now just by conspiring to agree to harm and then forgive and go from there.
Right.
How do you control that value?
It's gaming the system, right? Over time, these things at first don't have, they have a stated value that might be $1 trillion, but the amount of engagement that they have with the rest of the economy is limited. Like it's non-existent, to be quite honest, in the beginning. And what I hope to do is get these things wedged in, and by their reputation will determine their engagement, I think. You might get more engagement from one group of people who have a financial asset might trade with another that has one of these forgiveness assets, and kind of support each other's value just by swapping them at face value with like I say, a limited engagement. It probably wouldn't be 50% and 50%, but maybe it would. But when you have assets in the economy, like a house, say at $1 million price tag, I think the best we can hope for initially is that about 1% of that purchase price would engage a forgiveness asset. So it's kind of a thing that gives us a way for our angst to be codified into a document where we can declare how, how tragic, how damaging something was to us. But yet we can perform the one very special thing that no one else can do, is that when we're damaged, we're the only one who can put the person who damaged us back into honor. I feel, from my thought about all this. And when we do that, then we have it has a special way of creating an openness and the receptivity, I think, in the heart and mind of the person who's doing the damage. You might think of government agencies or something, who want to just kind of block things out and say this wasn't right. But as this moves ahead, and the notices go into default because they don't respond to them, and then you get a tacit agreement, if the presentment is structured right, that says, yeah, you did these, you're guilty of them, we're forgiving you, and we're putting the value of our forgiveness through into this asset. And yeah, I think it just has the way to start rebinding our hearts together. And then as we use the kind of money, if we can get to the point where it actually gets some traction, as we use it, it has a way of teaching us, and that there's a goodness in us, and a way of bringing people back into the fold, despite the things they've done. It really separates the wrong from the wrongdoer, and helps to isolate that out and separate it, and allows us to kind of reunite with people we'd otherwise, we talked before about how divide and conquer, the idea is to divide or separate people. And so this is kind of like trying to even bring us back into some set of détente or whatever with our enemies even.
Okay.
The beauty of having an infinite trust relationship with somebody is that when government comes against them, like my friend Starr, they falsely arrested her and imprisoned her for 15 days without a verified complaint. And so now I was able to write the city administrator, and I said, look, I have an infinite trust relationship with Starr, and you affecting her affects my net worth. I mean, I know we're dealing with different kinds of money, and we're talking about, the value of forgiveness and all of this, but it really does. I mean, she and I, and this forgiveness public license is almost bigger than, like either than like a marriage or something. I mean, you could probably walk away and dissolve the agreement, but for starters, it's like a powerful thing. And you might think about it being inflationary and all this, but really, doesn't each one of us have infinite worth? I mean, that might not seem reasonable at first, but I
agree, we do. But usually, that infinite worth is value placed upon us by ourselves and those closest to us, not necessarily everyone around us. And then you have the issue of those who simply don't agree with what you contemplate your forgiveness value is.
Yes. Yes.
And there you have a contested case, which, how do you reckon? Well, something not to get into today, I would presume, but just a question of how would you reconcile things of that nature? These are all things that you'd have to hammer out and get into a well-determined structure for this to get where I hope that you could get it to if it pans out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I do see that Anti-Vax has a comment down here that it sounds like they're asking a question about how there's so many individuals that are working independently and attempting to do these things. I absolutely agree. There are thousands upon thousands of small groups and individuals, and even a few large groups that are working to make changes where they need to be changed. The problem, as I see it, is they don't work together in the most effective way they possibly could. Imagine if we all combined together to become one fighting body. Let's use a boxer, for example. How effective and dangerous would a boxer be if he could throw multiple punches at multiple levels simultaneously? A shot at the head, a shot at the gut, a shot at the kidneys, and an uppercut all at the same time because he's got different hands to do it with. How dangerous would it be to get in the ring with somebody that could fight like that? Well, if all of these individuals and groups got together with their particular areas of expertise and know-how and formulated a system of fighting and attacking and defending that took advantage of having those kinds of multiple arms and used them to effect, changing this system would suddenly get a whole lot easier and happen a whole lot faster. The problem, as I see it, based upon simply my own observations from the number of those individuals and groups I've encountered in my 10 years in Austin, is that too many people see their way as the only real way to fix the problem. They don't see a cooperative way for a lot of them to work together because their method of approach is too vastly different to integrate. They're wanting to devise new systems to act upon the existing system, when in fact, my personal opinion is the better tactic is to utilize the parts of the system that are already in place, and these individuals and groups take their particular ability to manipulate and control that part and integrate them into a single fighting unit. And then you use the system to beat itself. You do that, you don't have to get somebody to support your view and your methods and your way of examining the rules, because you're using the same rules they already know. You're just using them in a different way. And because you're using them to effect, they have to begin to consider the possibility your way is the correct way and theirs isn't. And the difference there is when we're fighting against those who can control the way those rules are allowed to operate versus those who are simply using them. And right now, we've got too many of the former in control. They want to manipulate how the rules function in any given instance, regardless of how they're meant to function, and use them for the ends they desire instead of the ones that the rules, the facts, the evidence, and justice itself actually requires, all to protect the system they've built to operate outside of our system of rules and governance. And they've built it using the very legal mechanisms that we put into place within our system of government, by abusing it, by changing its purpose, empowering themselves to do it, and us apathetically sitting by and doing nothing to stop it and nothing to change it. Therein lies the problem, anti-vax, is that we're all working as independent superheroes instead of a combined Justice League.
There was something you said earlier about working local and, promoting people, or I don't know about promote. I'm using the word promote, but I had a friend.
Promote and support. I agree with that. Promote and support people that understand what is supposed to be happening, how it's supposed to happen, and have the moral aptitude and character to withstand the opportunities of corruption that are going to be thrown at them by the truckload.
Yeah. I had a friend or an acquaintance, and I helped him with his, he bought this machine for making phone calls, for get out the vote type of thing. He'd been elected to the U.S. or to the state Senate, the higher, there's like 33 senators in Wisconsin. And so he was one of those. And he told me this story about how when he came home from the legislature one day and he was looking in the mirror and shaving, he realized that he had broken his campaign pledge by voting for something. And it gives me the idea, and through multiple levels of inference, admittedly, that there's a certain level of mind control that might be at play in these legislatures. And
that's entirely possible. They use language to manipulate everything and everyone. See, the thing about law is people, when they hear terminology they're familiar with, they assume they know what it means, even when it's being used in the context of a legal statement rather than a common ordinary use statement. And that's a problem, because what the government has learned to do very well is to rewrite the English language to suit its own ends. That's one of those tricks of the trade that I try to teach people about. When you are reading a law, do not, under any circumstances, assume that you know the meaning of any word in it. I don't care how simple the word is. It can be the, it can be can, it can be if, it can be or, it can be and, it can be I, it can be person, it can be device. Doesn't matter what it is. If the statute has created a specific definition for it, that definition is the only thing that matters when that term is being used in a legal presentment of language, period. And how you understand it outside of that is completely irrelevant. And this again goes to one of the things the patronuts I was talking about tends to do. They take terms and definitions and they just don't understand them because they don't read them. Or they try to take a definition from, say, Black's Law and apply it to a statutory scheme that actually has a definition of the same term in it, and thus Black's Law is irrelevant. Only how the statute defines it is what's important. Then you've got how a state statute defines a term versus how a federal statute defines a term. This is something else the patronuts do a lot, is they'll take a federal definition and try to use it in place of a state statute definition, when they have yet to connect the dots to prove that the state legislation they're attempting to use this in is in any way related to the federal legislation that they're trying to draw the definition from. If they can't do that, then they can't say these definitions are interchangeable or that one supersedes the other in the case of the federal versus the state. They can't do that, yet they do it. Another good example is these people that are arguing get your passport as a state national. They obviously have never bothered to read the federal law on what a state national is actually defined as. A state national is not an American citizen, not by any stretch of the imagination, at least not all American citizens. A state national are particular indigenous people of certain places that were already part of America or became part of America as a state. Those are state nationals. It is not everybody that was born here. It is a select group of people that were part of a specific national group of persons that weren't part of America until their region of the world became a state, like Hawaii, for instance. A state national is, they're Samoans in Hawaii. Okay? They're a state national. The indigenous Indians to the continental U.S., the Eskimos in Alaska or in other places, those are state nationals. It's not everybody else. And so when you read the actual the federal law on what the state national is and getting the passport and all that, you'll find out that people are trying to sell people documents that They file with the federal government to get the passport. But the problem is the moment they file that document, it becomes a federal form. If that federal form contains false information of any kind, you are now guilty of tampering with a government document and falsification of a government document. And at the federal level, that is federal prison time. If they ever check that out and investigate it and come back to you and charge you with it, you will go to prison. And why people don't check this stuff before they accept it as fact is absolutely beyond me. I spent 2.5 years researching that bar accreditation, British Accreditation Registry BS before I came to the conclusion that's exactly what it was. It was BS. It was something somebody cooked up so that they could convince themselves they understood what they were reading and thought they understood. It had nothing to do with nothing. It wasn't real at all. And even the British barristers were unable to find any evidence that it's ever existed.
Wow. It's been a good show today, Eddie. Thank you. Thank you for coming on and
Well, again, thank you for having me. And I'm sorry if I talk too much. It's just I'm passionate about these things, and when I get on a roll, I tend to keep going.
we appreciate you and your thought processes and sharing with us today a little bit how you go about looking at law and how you encourage us to look at it that way and it's a lot of people trying to do a lot of different things for a lot of different directions, and hopefully we'll catch traction somewhere.
Yeah, and not everything that people are trying to do is bad. I'm not in any way saying that. There are some people that are leading people astray, like lemmings over a cliff or buffalo being chased by hunters over a cliff.
Yeah.
And that's my greatest fear for everybody I meet when they start talking about these other methods that we've discussed today, is that I've already researched everything up to the edge of the cliff. I know there's a cliff. I know that if you follow one step past this point, there is no returning from that cliff. And so when people ask me about them and I try to tell them, I said, look, you don't want to go down that road. And here's all the research on why. Here's everything I've uncovered about this. And yet you cannot get them to read it. And even if they read it, they refuse to understand it because they approach it with a closed mind instead of an open mind. They look at it, it disagrees with their paradigm, therefore it doesn't matter to them. They don't want to understand that their paradigm is based upon fiction. It's kind of like the Democrat and Republican mindset right now. They don't want to understand that everything they're doing is based upon a fictional perception of reality.
Yeah. Wow. Well, great. Do you want to go any longer, or did you want to wrap it up here?
I can do whatever you want to do.
Well, I think we've been going about 2 hours or so here, so it seems like probably a good time to wrap it up. Not that we couldn't go longer some other time if you want. I've done shows for like, I don't know, 7 hours.
Well, like I say, if you guys want to have me back at any time, just give me an email or a call or whatever and let me know, and I'll be happy to set aside some time and do so.
That's great. I want to thank Roger Holmes for kind of arranging this, getting us to meet and talk, and kind of like doing the producer work or something there. And thank you, Eddie Craig, for being on today's show.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, everybody. We're going to just, each of us are just going to have to hang up. The show's going to continue for a little bit in the black until I log back on with the other browser and turn it off.
All right.
We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks. You have a good day.
You too. Bye. Anyway, if you'd like to know more about my work and my show, you can go to forgivenesscapital.com. And I mentioned also the Forgiveness Public License, and that's at forgivenesspubliclicense.org. And it's just something I've been working on to try to align people's interests, appeal to the financial interest and greed of people, and to use that as a declarative sort of statement as to how much something is worth. And then instead of making the other person pay it, we just make them aware that it is that large and allow them to object. But if they don't object, it is as we say. Great. And I suppose that's about it for today. Thank you so much. Goodbye.